Chapter 3, Davenport, U.S. Army Locomotive Davenport, TM5, 127, 79, the Locomotive Davenport Bisler, Chapter 3, we are at Section 6, Maintenance Instructions, Section 6. The high potential test. Whenever the diesel electric locomotive operates under the Interstate Commerce Commission regulations, they must comply with the requirements given in the paragraph 253 of the ICC regulation inspection testing of the locomotive's other steam and governing. Periodically high potential test of the circuit windings carrying current of potential over 150 volts is mandatory of the test performed on all Department of Army diesel locomotives on any annual basis after general overhaul, extensive repairs, and electrical apparatus. 63. Preparing the test. To prepare a locomotive for these tests, you refer to the figure 44. Proceed as follows. Disconnect the wires of main ammeters, battery ammeters, charging ammeters, and main voltmeters. Disconnect the cab heater from the circuit because of the internal radio suppression capacitor. This is accomplished by disconnecting wire 99 and N. Disconnect all capacitors of the auxiliary generator brush holder to the ground. Disconnect the voltage regulators from the system due to the radio suppression components. This is accomplished by the disconnecting 30, 31, 32, 33 and the voltage regulator number 1, ending the leads of 34, 35, 36, and 37 from the voltage regulator number 2, and disconnect the ground lead from the ground relay. Cut out the circuit breaker. Disconnect the all indicating lights for the circuit, and this includes the wheel slippage indicating light, the ground armor light, the both engine warning lights, the battery parallel indicating the lights. Disconnect all battery leads. The battery. See, this connection leads are not grounded. This is preparing for the test. Application of the test. Manually place the reverser in the forward and the reverse position. The maximum high voltage of the main generator traction motor is equipped with 200 volts. A diesel dielectric test of not less than 1 minute per duration should be applied for the circuit to the carrying parts carrying the current potential of more than 150 volts. The volts applied for the circuits other than the motor, the valve generator winding shall be not less than 75% above the normal working voltage. The voltage applied for the winding should not be less than 50% above the normal working voltage. Aptly for 50% over the voltage between the ground locomotive frame and the G plus for the 1 minute noted for the not breakdown occurs about 50% over the voltage between the ground locomotive frame and each traction motor armature of the field leads the connection for the 1 minute. Not note that the no breakdown occurs. Make a careful examination of the weakness indicated in the remedy of all defects is located. The generation traction generator. The safe RPMs 1,450 volts of the 350 amperes at 11, 1,300 shunt field amperes at 11, battery auxiliary field amperes at 2. Brush arms of the per generator 6, per arms 3, graduated brushes national AX5. The size of the brushes are 3/4 of an inch by 1/3 of an inch by 2/4 of an inch. Brush tension to the pounds within full length of the brush are 6.5 to 8 pounds. Resistance while winding arms at 25 degrees Celsius. Armature is at 77 ten thousandths. Communication field is 48 ten thousandths. Series fields is 29 ten thousandths. Shunt field is 19 7 tenths, and battery field of 13 39 hundredths. Weight pounds. Generator completion of 30,125. Armature shaft of 1,255. The E bearings are the type of the railway free to fit ball bearing. Normal pole bores are center poles in inches bearing main poles of the 17 and 18 hundredths of an inch. Communicating poles of the 17 and 5 thousandths of an inch. Description: the generator is shunt wound direction current machine of the standard railway construction, including the single housing supported high friction bearing at the front of the end arranged directly connected through the flexible coupling of the engine flywheel. The machine is self-ventilated air being drawn, opening the communicator. Circulated armature defects around the field coil is discharged of the fan air outlets of the coupling at the coupling end. For field wheel windings are provided on this machine, the communicating field of the separate winding of the other three. I'll back out of this. What you have here is your traction generator outline. And I'll zoom back in. In addition to the main In addition to the main shunt field, the auxiliary and series field mounted on the main field of the poles, the auxiliary field energized by the battery source to provide excitation for the generator, ensuring that the more rapidly positively build up the generator field, improving the voltage regulation for application for the particular class of the series. Series field supplies the available starting surfaces in those cases of the generator is used by the motor when starting the engine. 867. The clean generator clean dried and the keep of the generator free of the dust, occasionally blowing in and out, compressing the compressed air to the hand bellows. The high air pressure is used do not hold the nozzle air hose of the connect close to the windings as pressure may damage the insulation tape. Wipe as possible the grease and dirt and oil with windings of the dry cloth, cleansing of the rams, motion of the solvent, drying the windings thoroughly with the clean and dry cloth. Parts within accessible to the hand may be cleaned with a swab moistened with the solvent. The bearings, the generator equipped with a single bearing of the commutator ended through the lubrication instruction. The bearings ranging from the 1 to 3 years, taking out of the bearing of the cap off, removing the old grease of the bearing of the grease chamber, the wash consistently equal with the kerosene denatured alcohol, rubbing all caked and hardened grease, removing the cleansing liquid, and washing from the hot light and oil before repacking the bearing with the new grease. 69. The brush holders. The brush holders can be expected removing communicator inspected at least once a month for the pressure of the grit and dirt. Has been caused by the brushes to stick. The brush holders in the proper spring tension and the maintain of the valve specified in paragraph 65. Discarded brushes when they have been worn in the length to extend the brush's pressure. The finger will cause the 1/8 of an inch for the end of the travel by the time of the next inspection. The brush's thickness is very important. The clearance of the new brushes holder should be approximately 4/10,000ths of an inch or 1/100th of an inch. If the clearance of the much of the less minimum carbonation to sticks into the box over 25,000ths of an inch will rattle the wear away of the size of the chip of the brake. And the width of the brush is not important as it may have much of 1/16th of an inch clearance of the backs without causing trouble. The brush pressure of the commutator maintained with the means of the clock type of the springs which exert the pressure of the fingers which rest on the top of the brushes. Brush pressures may be measured at the attaching small bearings, planes to press fingers directly over the brush, pulling them straight up to the line of the brush and travel under the finger is just lifted clearly of the brush. The brush pressure is incorrect. Remove the brush holder, adjust the valves. Insert the piece of the 1/8 of an inch diameter drill rod with one hole to the tension bar. The spring recurring adjustment relieve tensions of the cotter pin. Remove the cotter pin, increasing the degree, hastening the tension of the required, replacing the cotter pin. Keep under the side of the brush holder carbon 1/8 of an inch of the commutator, reducing chances of brushes breakage. Adjustment can be made in loosening, championing block bolt, and moving the brush holder to the correct position. A fiber sheet of the proper thickness makes a handy gauge. 70. Commutator. The commutator, which was taken one of the polishes shown no sign of the wear, does not require any attention. If the commutator is roughened, badly worn, or burned, remove the armature, place the lathe, and then when the turned or grindstone to give the uniform surface, after which the mica must be regrooved with a special saw. Mica insulation between the copper segments were grooved to undercut it initially to the depth of 3/64ths of an inch. The commutator wears and turned in the ground of the ground groove should be maintained since the high mica will spoil the brush fits. And here you see the communicator main series coils as they wrap around the magnets here, the south north for 6 of the rear end and communicator main service coils. The views of the show coils laid on the bench of the armature side, south north for 6 series of 6 around the positive negative coil of the armature slide. The armature there is the traction generation field. Same thing as the magnets going around as in the polarity test. As the proper position of each coil is indicated by the tag shown below. With the compass check of the polarity collection coils, it is out used in the bench and after the assembly in the frame, using the resistor to give the about 5 amperes, correcting current flow of the direction of the show the arrows. Well, let's go read C again. C. The mica insulation before the copper segments are grooved and undercut initially depth of 3/64ths and an inch. The commutator wears and turned to the ground of the groove should be maintained since the high mica should be spoil the brush and fit and cause sparking. Undercutting can be done. The best advantage to use the one of the small driven power. The saws which are built for the purpose after the communicator has been turned to the stone or undercutting of the burrs, which allows the form to the edge of the bar during the process, which carefully remove the three corners, cutting of the tool to the ends of the commutator has been rounded. The slots cleaned out of the commutator, finally polished with the sandpaper, then blown off with the compressed air, lifting the brushes, smoothing the commutator with the band machine, and do not replace any of all until all the grit has been removed. Never use emery cloth or emery paper on a commutator. 71 December. Dismantling and assembling the generator. Dismantling a generator may cause, in the case of necessary internal repairs of the armature bearing of the field coils. Following the procedure will follow taking the generator apart. Remove all electrical connections between the generator and the apparatus. Remove all bolts holding the coupling disc to the flywheel. Remove all the bolts holding the generator frame from the engine to the engine bell. Remove the bolts holding the generator supporting feet of the locomotive mounting. Slide the generator away from the engine. Insert the filter wedges between the armature poles, preventing the armature from rubbing on the poles. The complete generator may be outfitted in the mounting. Removed in the locomotive. Removal of the armature when necessary to remove the armature from the generator. From dismantling the generator engine is described to precede the paragraph. List of the brushes of the far enough out of the brush box. This will not slide back on the commutator. Protects the commutator wrapping in the heavy fish paper. Remove the bolt holding the coupling of the generator coupling in the flange. This allows the coupling disc and the fan to assemble to be removed and will permit the handling of the armature with the ropes without damage to the disc. Removing the bolts that hold the front of the bearing cartridges by the house and inserting the two armature removal studs to the taped holes of the cartridge. The studs are not furnished with the generator. Can be similar with long studs as shown on the tool drawing figure 10 of the studs to keep the commutator and striking the brush from striking the brush holders. 7. The armature can now be removed from the generator, passing the heavy rope of the armature, removing the armature slowly toward the coupling end of the generator. A piece of pipe will be needed over the shell extension of the commutator and extend into the permit the sliding of the armature through the frame enough that it can be handled entirely through the other end. Care must be taken through the armature does not rub the poles during the operation, or the commutator does not rub the brush holder box. Remove the armature bearing. Refer to the figure 11 as guided to proper removal of the bearing. Remove the armature of the generator as described in preceding the paragraph block of the horizontal position. Remove the bolts with holding the outside of the bearing cap of the cartridge, removing the cap. Straighten the locker washer. Remove the bearing lock nuts using the special spanner wear wrench shown in figure 10. Pull the bearing in grease with the grease thrower using the special puller shown on figure 10. Screw the 4 studs of the cartridge, placing the single plate over the studs against the end of the shaft. Tighten the nuts, or even outside of the outplane of the bearing assembly is pulled off the shaft. Remove the bearing from its push and fit in the cartridge. If necessary, tap lightly around the cartridge with a rawhide mallet. This is a drawing of a traction motor gear puller. You see in plate 1. You see a 3/4 of an inch by 10 and 3/4 of an inch, 10 and 3/4 of an inch steel plate, burned smooth, but to 12 diameters. There's 12 diameters on here. So, number 2. Here's the number 1. Once again, the disc. The 2 is a stud from the 9 3/4 of an inch, 5 inch diameter steel bar, and 5/8 of an inch to 11 hexagonal steel nut. On 3 and 4 5/8 of an standard washer followed behind it. The lifting eye of the 3/4 of an inch bolt and plant flank of the SA Associated American Engineering thread of the 3/4 of an inch 16 through 1/4 of an inch thread length. There's your armature lifting eye with a number 6 adjustable communicator nut wrench. So this is your special communicator and bearing nut wrench. Wrap the bearing in the protective covering and leaving the grease of the bearing. The grease of the bearing will serve the preventing the rust of the bearing. Must be well cleaned and inspected before reassembly. Assembly armature bearing. Refer to the figure as guided with the proper assembly. Block the armature for the horizontal position. Clean all the parts before the starting of the assembly. Carefully inspect the bearings for cracks, pitting, and excessive caution. Care must be also taken in the keep of all dirt and grit and all away from the ball bearing. Placing inside the grease of the thrower bearing in the higher temperature oil at temperature of 100 degrees Celsius or 215 degrees Fahrenheit. Support of these parts are approximately 2 inches above the bottom of the oil container allow the dirt to drop below the bearing to prevent the heating from striking the bearing directly. The pack of the grease in the bearing cartridge that had full grease, and then place the cartridge over the shaft and slide it into all the way back against the commutator. Remove the grease thrower into the hot oil, wipe off the excess oil, shrink the thrower of the shaft, and the chamfer slide out of the place solidly against the shoulder on the shaft of the bucking up the tool is culos. Remove the bearing of the hot oil, wipe off the inner outer fitting, slip in the place on the shield, hold the bearing solidly against the grease thoroughly tightly, and apply the bearing lock, washer lock, nut lock securely. Fill the spaces between the balls and the bearing grease as specified in the figure 5. Allow the bearing to cool as contracted, then slide the cartridge place over the bearing. 10. Pack the lower half of the grease pocket in the outer bearing cap with fold the grease. Place the cap of the grease in place with the bolt and the cartridge. Some portion of the grease of the bearing cap must be take contact with the bearing when assembled. Check to make sure the grease fitting is not damaged. Assembling the generator. Assemble the generator in a horizontal position. Protect the commutator and wrapping it in with a heavier fish paper. When placing the armature back in the frame, the two armature, remove the studs. Inserted the tapered hold of the bearing cartridge to act as a guide and bring in the bearing cartridge into position, thus lining the bolts and holding the housing. Lifting the armature in with a heavy rope around the core and more slowly into the frame. Then we use the piece of pipe over the shaft extension of the commutator end of the guiding armature into place. Take care the armature does not rub into the poles and the commutator does not rub the brush holder boxes. It may be found that some forces is needed to pull the bearing cartridge into place with the commutator and the housing. To obtain this force, the two bolts longer than the bolts regularly used in the holding cartridge edge of the housing. To pull the bearing cartridge close enough to the final position of the housing of the regular bolts can be put and tightened. Replace the coupling disc in the fan assembly. Remove the fish paper from around the commutator. Lower the brushes. Lifting a single ball bearing generator of the engine. See that the contact with the face of the generator coupling disc of the engine flywheel and the bell housing fits are cleaning with no burrs, rough spots. Cleaning the coupling face of the engine flywheel to make sure the perpendicular the axis for the crankshaft. This is best done fixing surface gauge rigidly engine bed plate with the recording the total eccentricity shown by the gauge of the flyway faces the complete revolution. Total eccentricity should not exceed 5/10,000ths of an inch. Here you see a picture of a traction generator bearing assembly with number 1 bearing housing. The generator shaft, the bearing cartridge, the bearing cap of the free fit ball bearings is 1 through 5. So you're going down the side here. 6 the ball bearing is lock nut, the 7 ball bearing lock washer, the 8 the gasket of the bearing cap, the 1/8 of the special grease plug, 5/16 and 8 by 18 inches by 1 hex of the head old steel bolt, the 5/16 standard lock washer, 5/18 for 11 inch by 1/3 of an inch hex head steel bolt, a 5/8 inch standard steel lock washer grease top thrower, and the bearing will stop in the bearing bearing of grease. The grease nameplate, sealing the grease and drying bearing and lubrication, the pressing, fitting, bearing and lubrication, the traction generator assembly. To the eccentricity shown in the gauge of the flywheel, the face on 1 completion revolution, the total eccentricity should not exceed 10,000ths of an inch. 5/10,000ths of an inch. The support of the armature of the lower main power piece is straps at 3/32ths of an inch thick, so placed that they can be withdrawn to the generator as soon as possible, assembled to the engine. The generator should not be adjusted until the concentric of the engine shifts. The generator will now freely enter the engine bell housing. Move the generator toward the engine of the coupling and adjust engaged but the free frame of the engine bell housing, inserting the coupling bolts and screwing the adjust unsung. Remove the fabric strips of the wire be used in support of the armature. Engage on the frame of the flywheel fits and insert all frame bolts. Cut gradually and tightening the bolt to armature of the coupling frame fits until the bolts are tightened. Taking the precautions so that the fits enter without being forced. The generator frame of the engine bell housing must not be beholden into the coupling bolts. These bell housing bolts must be tightened at the same time the coupling bolts are being tightened. I'm going to finish up the V sections and before we get to 10. And then I'll take a break. 72 general operational limits, maximum 331,000 safe RPMs, volts at 40, amperes at 50, and shunt field of amperes at 5. The brushes number of the arms 4, the brushes per arms 4. one size brushes in inches, 3/8 of an inch by 1.5 inch brush. Tension of the pounds with fully length of the brush is 1 1/4 of an inch. Minimum radial length of the carbon when more worn inches. 1 bearings, the type of the railway type of the free fit ball bearings. Normal D, the normal pole bears of the center poles of the inches. Main poles of the 580 72 thousandth of an inch. Communicating poles 872 thousandths of an inch. Weight pounds, complete armature pounds of the 85. The complete generator pounds of 200. The resistant winding is the ohms at 25 degrees Celsius. Armature the 11 hundredths of an inch and 34 thousandths of an inch. In communicating field, shunting field at 5 and 37 thousandths of an inch. Description of the generator: the four-pole generator, direct contacting communicating pole, shut wound generator around a range of the self-ventilation but means of fan of the rear end of the armature shaft extension provided at each end. 74 cleaning the paragraph 65 through 71 for the leaning details. 75 the bearings are held in the position of the shaft of the housing, the inner bearing cowls. See figure 5 lubrication instruction during the assembly of an overhaul. Grease of the bearings as follows. Refer to the figure 13. The bearing assembly details complete the pack of all internal spaces of the bearing with the grease filled with the lower half of the housing. The grease is chamber of the grease. Disassembly and assembly. Disassembly details also bearing maintenance will be similar to discussed in paragraph 65 and 71. All special pullers in the figure 14 are to use the apparent for the drawing. From the drawing, brush holders and brushers and communicators information maintenance of the brush holders, brushes, communicators, etc. Refer to the section paragraph 78 through 85. Here's another auxiliary generator outline. It leads to the extent of the 24 inches of the outside of the generator frame, and it shows the shaft extension the same as the either end shaft guard in both ends. 1/8 of an inch pipe plug with the nameplate and its dimensions is in the auxiliary generator outline. Here you see auxiliary generator bearing assembly. 1, you have the bearing bracket. 2, you have the generator shaft. 3, the bearing caps. 4, the 3/8 of an inch, 16-inch, 2-inch steel hex hub nuts. 5 is a 3/8 of an inch steel lock washer, so the lock was behind the nut. 6 is a head gasket steel pipe plug for 1/4 of an inch, which plugs in underneath the shaft and the bearings on the outside. Bearing grease 8 is 8, so 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I can't see 8, but the bearing grease. Bearing bracket. The bracket required is number 9. The bearing bracket. And number 10, the nameplate of the 59860. And that's This here is an auxiliary generator bearing puller, so you use this to pull the bearings out of the generator. The 2-arm adjustable bearing pull is number 1, and then the steel shaft, the cam of 1 3/4 of an inch steel bar 2. Once again, we have another auxiliary generator field wire drawing, north south north south north north 1 splits in around the plus of the windings. You see the windings as it is communicated on the communitary view. They're going not counterclockwise. 76 or section 9 traction motor. I'm gonna take a break and start a new one tape.